The summer of 1800 hung heavy over Virginia, thick with humidity and tension. In the workshops of Richmond and the plantations surrounding it, enslaved people moved through their daily labor under a peculiar kind of watchfulness. The air itself seemed charged with something unspoken, dangerous, revolutionary. Gabriel stood at his forge on Thomas Prosper's plantation in Henrico County, 6 feet tall and powerfully built, his arms corded with muscle from years of metalwork. At 24 years old, he was literate, a rarity and a danger in the eyes of those who depended on keeping enslaved people ignorant. But Gabriel's education would prove to be far more dangerous than his masters ever imagined. The forge glowed orange in the dimness, and as Gabriel hammered iron into shape, his mind worked on a different kind of transformation. He was reshaping reality itself, planning something that would either liberate thousands or cost him everything. Gabriel wasn't alone in his dreams. His wife Nanny stood with him. His brothers Solomon and Martin were equally committed, their whispered conversations in the quarters going late into the night. But perhaps his most crucial ally was a man named Jack Bowler, known as Ditcher Jack, whose work took him across different plantations and allowed him to move with relative freedom. The forge became their meeting place. The ringing of hammer on anvil covered their voices as they discussed what had once seemed impossible, a coordinated uprising that would seize Richmond itself, the capital of Virginia, hold Governor James Monroe hostage, and force negotiations for freedom. What made Gabriel believe such a thing could succeed? Welcome to Historic Crimes TV, where you get the true story of events that have happened in the past which helped shape the history of the world that we are living in. Before we begin, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. There were the numbers. Richmond's white population numbered fewer than 4,000. The enslaved population in the surrounding counties exceeded them significantly. Second, there was the moment America itself was young and fractured, with political divisions between Federalists and Republicans tearing at the social fabric. France's Revolution still echoed in everyone's minds, and Saint-Domingue's successful slave rebellion under Toussaint Louverture proved that the impossible could become real. Gabriel had studied warfare through conversations with white artisans and through his own reading. He understood that revolutions required more than anger. They required strategy, coordination, and timing. Throughout the spring and summer, he moved carefully through the network of enslaved people in Henrico, Caroline, and Louisa counties, recruiting. His plan was elegant in its boldness. They would gather on the night of August 30th, a Saturday when enslaved people traditionally had more freedom of movement. They would divide into 3 columns. One would seize the arsenal and its weapons. Another would capture the powder magazine. The third would take the governor's residence and hold Monroe hostage. With the capital secured and arms in their hands, they could negotiate from a position of strength, or if necessary, fight a war they believed they could win. But Gabriel added a crucial element that revealed both his strategic thinking and his humanity. They would spare certain white people. Quakers, Methodists, and Frenchmen, those who opposed slavery or had shown sympathy, would be left unharmed. This wasn't merely about revenge. It was about creating a new society. As summer progressed, the conspiracy grew. Estimates would later suggest that somewhere between 1,000 and several thousand people knew of the plot to varying degrees. They gathered at barbecues and fish fries, at religious meetings and late-night sessions in the quarters. Gabriel spoke to them of liberty, of their rights as men, of the injustice of their bondage. One recruit later testified that Gabriel told them the Negroes had a right to fight for their freedom, and he would lead them. Another remembered him invoking the biblical story of the Israelites' deliverance from Egypt. Gabriel understood that people needed not just a plan, but a cause that transcended their individual suffering. The weapons began to accumulate. Gabriel forged swords at his blacksmith shop, creating crude but deadly blades from scythe blades. They fashioned bullets. They identified sources of muskets and powder. The preparations were meticulous, almost military in their organization. But in any conspiracy involving hundreds or thousands of people, secrecy becomes exponentially harder to maintain. Whispers spread. Some who heard of the plot were terrified, not of their masters, but of what would happen if the uprising failed. They had seen what happened to rebels. They had heard stories of bodies hanging from trees, of brutal public executions meant to terrorize others into submission. By late August, Gabriel's conspiracy had grown almost too large to contain. The forge still glowed each day, hammering out both horseshoes and saw blades. Gabriel walked among his recruits with confidence, believing that history was about to turn on its axis. The date was set, August 30th, 1800. In just days, Richmond would wake to revolution, or Gabriel would die trying to make it so. August 30th dawned hot and oppressive. Throughout the day, enslaved people in the conspiracy went about their usual tasks with heightened awareness, counting down the hours until nightfall. Gabriel had designated an old spring about 6 miles outside Richmond, known as Brook Swamp or Young Spring, as the gathering point. From there, they would march in 3 columns on the sleeping capital. At the Prosser plantation, Gabriel made his final preparations. The swords were ready. The plan was rehearsed. His brothers Solomon and Martin confirmed that their sections were prepared. Jack Bowler sent word that recruits from distant plantations were on their way. Everything was in place. But 2 men, Pharaoh and Tom, enslaved to Mosby Shepherd, wrestled with their consciences throughout that long August day. Pharaoh and Tom had heard of the conspiracy. Perhaps they had even been approached to join, but fear gnawed at them. Fear of failure, fear of the terrible retribution that would follow, fear of watching their families suffer for someone else's revolution, or perhaps they believed, as some did, that the plot was doomed from the start and would only bring misery down on all enslaved people, guilty and innocent alike. That afternoon, as storm clouds began to gather on the horizon, Pharaoh and Tom made their decision. They approached Mosby Shepherd and revealed what they knew. The revelation sent Shepherd into immediate action. He contacted other plantation owners, who rushed word to Richmond. Governor James Monroe, a future president of the United States, received the shocking intelligence that thousands of enslaved people planned to attack the capital that very night. Monroe moved swiftly. He ordered the militia to assemble and the arsenal to be secured. Guards were posted throughout Richmond. Armed patrols rode out into the surrounding countryside. The authorities braced for an assault that might come from any direction. But as the afternoon wore on, something else intervened: the weather. The storm that had been threatening broke with apocalyptic force. Rain came down in sheets, turning roads into rivers of mud. Brooks and creeks overflowed their banks. The bridges that Gabriel's forces would need to cross into Richmond became impassable, washed out by the deluge, or too dangerous to navigate in the darkness and driving rain. At Brook Swamp, the conspirators began to gather despite the storm. They came through the rain, some armed with the crude swords Gabriel had forged, others carrying clubs or planning to seize weapons once they reached Richmond. The water rose around them as they waited for their full force to assemble. Gabriel stood in the storm, watching his carefully laid plans dissolve like the roads beneath the flooding rain. The military precision that had defined his conspiracy collapsed in the face of nature's fury. Those who had reached the meeting point couldn't advance as the roads were impassable. Those who hadn't yet arrived were delayed or prevented from coming by the same storm. The 3-column attack was impossible. But worse news arrived with stragglers who made it through the storm. The conspiracy had been betrayed. Richmond knew. The militia was mobilized. The element of surprise, the crucial advantage that might have let a lightly armed force take a fortified capital, was gone. Gabriel faced the hardest decision of his life. Some of his followers urged attack anyway. They had come this far. They should die fighting rather than submit. Others counseled retreat and regrouping. Perhaps the storm had saved them, given them time to plan better, to try again when circumstances were more favorable. In the end, Gabriel ordered his followers to disperse. "Return to your quarters," he told them. "Say nothing." Perhaps they could still salvage secrecy, could still try again if they scattered now, before the white authorities could identify who had gathered at Brook Swamp. They melted away into the storm-torn night. leaving Gabriel standing alone with his brothers and closest allies. The moment had passed. The revolution had been betrayed by two of their own and stopped by an act of God. Over the next few days, as the floodwaters receded and the roads dried, a strange paralysis seemed to grip both the conspirators and the authorities. Gabriel hadn't been arrested. Not yet. Neither had most of his followers. The white authorities knew something had been planned, but in the confusion of the storm and the initial panic, they didn't yet know the full scope of what had almost occurred. Gabriel went to the ground. He fled from the Prosser plantation, moving through a network of supporters who hid him even as the net began to close. Some of his followers did the same. Others returned to their normal routines, hoping that their participation would go unnoticed. But Governor Monroe was methodical. He began ordering arrests based on the initial intelligence from Pharaoh and Tom. The two informants were pressed for names, descriptions, any detail that might help identify the conspiracy's leaders. Other enslaved people were interrogated, some volunteering information in hopes of leniency, others breaking under pressure or threat. The authorities quickly realized they were dealing with something far larger than a simple escape plan. This had been a coordinated military operation involving potentially thousands of people. The scope of it terrified Virginia's white population. If enslaved people could organize on this scale, if they could plan with this sophistication, then the entire foundation of the slave society was more fragile than anyone had admitted. The arrests mounted. Solomon and Martin were captured. Jack Bowler was taken. One by one, Gabriel's inner circle fell into the hands of the authorities. Trials began almost immediately, held under special courts of Oyer and Terminer, courts authorized to hear and determine cases without jury trials for enslaved defendants. The testimonies revealed the staggering scope of Gabriel's plan. Witnesses described the military organization, the weapons cache, the multi-pronged attack strategy, the plans to seize the capital and take the governor hostage. The white population reeled at how close they had come to catastrophe. But Gabriel remained free. For weeks, he evaded capture, moving through the shadows of Virginia's slave quarters, perhaps hoping to regroup or escape entirely. His freedom became a kind of legend in itself, the rebel leader who had defied them all, who remained at large while his conspiracy came apart around him. Where was Gabriel, and how long could he stay free? Gabriel moved like a ghost through Virginia's landscape of bondage. In the days after the failed uprising, while his brothers and closest allies fell into the authorities' hands one by one, he demonstrated the same cunning that had nearly pulled off an impossible revolution. He headed east toward Norfolk and the coast. Perhaps he hoped to find passage on a ship to escape to somewhere like France, Haiti, anywhere beyond the reach of Virginia's vengeance. He traveled at night, sleeping in swamps and woods, relying on the underground network of enslaved people who risked everything to hide and feed him. The reward for his capture climbed higher. Governor Monroe, increasingly anxious about the political implications of the conspiracy, wanted Gabriel alive, if possible, to stand trial, to reveal the full extent of the plot, to be made an example of. But he would settle for Gabriel dead if it came to that. Meanwhile, in Richmond, the trials had become a grim parade. The special courts moved quickly, hearing case after case. The testimony revealed not just the conspiracy's scope, but its sophistication. Gabriel had organized his followers into military ranks. He had appointed colonels and captains. He had planned for different contingencies. This wasn't a spontaneous riot or a desperate escape attempt. It was a planned revolution. Solomon faced the court with defiance. When asked about his role, he refused to show contrition. Martin likewise remained steadfast. Their loyalty to Gabriel and to the cause never wavered, even as the noose beckoned. The sentences came swiftly, death by hanging. 15 men were executed in the first wave of trials. Their bodies were displayed publicly, a message to any who might consider following Gabriel's path. The executions were meant to terrorize, to break the spirit of resistance that Gabriel had kindled. But the trials also revealed something the authorities found deeply unsettling. The conspiracy had drawn support across different types of enslaved people. Not just field hands, but skilled artisans like Gabriel himself. Not just the young and hot-headed, but older men who had calculated the odds and decided rebellion was worth the risk. The conspiracy had even included a few free black people, making the threat seem even more pervasive. Thomas Jefferson, then serving as president, monitored the situation from Washington. He wrote to Governor Monroe advising careful handling of the crisis. Too harsh a response might provoke exactly the rebellion Virginia was trying to prevent. Too lenient, and it might encourage others to try what Gabriel had attempted. Jefferson, architect of America's Declaration of Independence and its assertions about liberty, found himself advising on how to efficiently suppress those seeking their own liberty. Virginia's leaders, many of whom had been revolutionaries themselves just 24 years earlier, now played the role of the British Crown, putting down a rebellion seeking the very ideals they had once proclaimed. As September turned to October, Gabriel remained at large. The longer he evaded capture, the more legendary he became. In the quarters throughout Virginia, enslaved people whispered about him. Some said he had made it to Haiti. Others claimed he was organizing a new uprising. The truth was more desperate. He was running out of places to hide. On September 23rd, nearly 4 weeks after the conspiracy's collapse, Gabriel made it to Norfolk. There, he approached a schooner called the Mary, hoping to secure passage north or perhaps to freedom abroad. The ship's captain was Richardson Taylor, and Gabriel's fate hinged on what kind of man Taylor proved to be. It turned out Taylor was the worst kind, one who saw profit in betrayal. He pretended to agree to take Gabriel aboard, then turned him in for the reward. On September 25th, Gabriel was finally captured and transported back to Richmond in chains. The capital buzzed with anticipation of the trial. Gabriel, the mysterious leader whose vision had nearly overturned Virginia society, would finally face justice. The authorities wanted him to talk, to reveal any remaining conspirators, to explain how an enslaved blacksmith had come so close to accomplishing what no one had thought possible. Gabriel's trial began on October 6, 1800. The courtroom was packed with white spectators eager to see the rebel who had terrorized their nights. Gabriel stood before the court in chains, still powerfully built despite his weeks as a fugitive, his bearing dignified. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Witness after witness testified to his leadership role, his planning, his recruitment efforts. The prosecution painted him as a dangerous radical who had manipulated others into a suicidal plot. But Gabriel refused to cooperate with the narrative they wanted to build. According to most accounts, he declined to defend himself or to implicate others. He wouldn't beg for mercy or express regret. In his silence, there was both defiance and dignity. The verdict was never in doubt, guilty on charges of conspiracy and insurrection. The sentence, death by hanging. What happened in the days between his conviction and execution remains partially obscured by history, but some accounts suggest Gabriel did speak, not to beg for his life, but to explain his motives. One report claims he invoked the American Revolution itself, asking how white Virginians could condemn him for seeking what they had sought from Britain. Another suggests he spoke of Saint Domingue's successful revolution, arguing that enslaved people had the same right to fight for freedom that the French revolutionaries had claimed. True or apocryphal, these accounts capture something essential about Gabriel's rebellion. It was rooted in the revolutionary ideals of the age, turned against the hypocrites who proclaimed liberty while holding human beings in bondage. On October 10, 1800, Gabriel was hanged in Richmond. He was 24 years old, but his execution didn't end the trials. The conspiracy had been so extensive that the prosecutions continued for weeks. Eventually, more than 25 men were executed for their roles in the plot. Others were transported and sold to slave traders who would take them far from Virginia, breaking up the networks that had made the conspiracy possible. Pharaoh and Tom, the informants whose revelations had doomed the uprising, were granted their freedom and a reward. They disappeared from history, their names surviving only as footnotes, traitors to some, pragmatists, or even heroes to others, depending on one's perspective. The financial cost of the executions troubled Virginia's legislature. The state had to compensate slaveholders for the value of executed enslaved people, and the bill mounted into thousands of dollars. Some legislators began to question whether hanging so many valuable human property made economic sense. Their debate revealed the brutal calculus of a slave society, human lives reduced to balance sheets. But beyond the immediate costs, Gabriel's conspiracy had dealt a psychological blow to Virginia's white population from which it never fully recovered. In the months and years following Gabriel's execution, Virginia transformed itself into something darker and more controlled than it had been before. The conspiracy had revealed the lie at the heart of the slave system, that enslaved people were content, that they accepted their condition, that rebellion was unthinkable. The Virginia legislature moved swiftly to close what they saw as the vulnerabilities that had made Gabriel's conspiracy possible. New laws restricted the movements of enslaved people even more severely. Gatherings were forbidden without white supervision. Enslaved people could no longer hire out their own time, as Gabriel had done. The relative independence he had enjoyed as a blacksmith was now seen as dangerously destabilizing. Gabriel's story ended on that gallows in October 1800. He died believing, we can assume, that his cause was just even if his timing was wrong. He died knowing that he had frightened Virginia's masters, that he had shown what was possible, that he had refused to accept bondage as his inevitable fate. The men who died with him, his brothers Solomon and Martin, Jack Bowler, and dozens of others deserve to be remembered as well. They were not Gabriel's dupes or mindless followers. They were thinking, moral agents who made conscious choices to risk everything for freedom. Gabriel's conspiracy helped set the stage for slavery's ultimate destruction. The institution survived for another 65 years after his execution, but it did so under increasing moral, political, and practical pressure. The North gradually abolished slavery within its borders. The slave trade was banned in 1808, just 8 years after Gabriel's conspiracy. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, each represented a political system struggling to contain the contradictions that Gabriel had embodied. Abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman invoked the principles that Gabriel had fought for. They asked how America could claim to be a beacon of liberty while holding millions in bondage. They demanded that the nation live up to its professed ideals. Gabriel's rebellion was part of the evidence. They marshaled proof that enslaved people were not content, that they recognized their rights, that they would fight for freedom if given the chance. When the Civil War finally came in 1861, it vindicated Gabriel's central insight. Slavery would end through conflict, not through voluntary reform. Nearly 200,000 black men, many of them formerly enslaved, fought for the Union. They were Gabriel's spiritual descendants, taking up arms against the system that had held them in bondage. Their courage and sacrifice helped ensure that slavery would not survive the war. Gabriel Prosser's rebellion lasted only one night, and even that night, it was stopped before it could truly begin. But its reverberations continue more than 2 centuries later.